trails and the gardens and the orchards.
There's a few more layers, but that's yeah, it's really yeah, yeah, for as an architect, like the so kind of like the core of that is that they saw that the technical, like how you deal with water, is merged with this opportunity to connect to people. And so they're not so this is flipping the script of the way we build cities is the engineers solve that technical problem, and
Yeah.
the social problem just is hardly considered. But they saw this as an opportunity to solve both problems at the same time, which I think is the
Sure.
core of regenerative design. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so there's much to learn. As you ask this question, and I'm so sorry, the another model would be to look at a, a Greek city and
Greek.
what a Greek city, ancient Greek
Yeah.
city,
Hmm.
and I um, on the in the energy side after 350 BC, from the inspiration from Socrates, most Greek cities were designed on this solar grid, which village homes also incorporated.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And that in itself, just doing that, just order um, orienting a city, a building to the south or to the well, in Brian's case, to the north, to the sun. It's proven over and over and over and over again and it's just that simple thing can reduce the energy carbon footprint by a half or more.
Yeah,
Right.
Um,
particularly in the lower latitudes.
yeah, it's
As in like solar passive design.
passive solar.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
integrating those two, passive
yeah,
Yeah,
solar
yeah.
and water,
yeah,
is really
And
key.
water.
and
Sure,
that's what
sure.
Village Homes is so brilliant. It combined that started with these two things that give life on the earth. But the Greek city also the center of the community is the agora, the market, and it's not.
Right, right. And this is a good social piece that brings everyone together for lots of reasons.
There's
Yeah,
an interesting tension that's worth mentioning here, and that is that permaculture design, if you're going to use rows, want to go north-south because that provides better ecological environment east and west of the trees. So if you're going to have a line of
Mhm.
trees, they actually want to go north-south. So that's a tension against homes that would be east-west or buildings that would be east-west and would manage a passive
Mhm.
solar design. So there's an interesting question there on how to manage that. And
yeah,
I think that requires a bit of theoretical analysis because I just ran across this tension in the last 2 or 3 weeks.
yeah.
And you'd like the
That-
Yeah.
permaculture and you'd like the
yeah.
passive solar. So
Brian
that's
and I
a
have, I would say as a designer, where there's tension, there's a design opportunity.
agreed.
Sure.
So let's work on that, Carl, maybe offline. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you, Kevin, Victor,
Yeah, you guys,
Martin,
welcome,
Thanks.
welcome. Thank you for that
Tanya,
warm up. Uh,
or
just
Sophia.
now. Yeah, let me let everybody in. Happy Saturday, everybody, and welcome to the Regenerative Neighborhood Framework call series. Dr. Brian invited a friend, Carl Welty, who is an architect, and we were just, I was asking him some questions about design strategies to optimize for social interaction. And the question comes from my mind being very focused this week specifically on human systems, which is what this call will be about and what we'll be exploring as a group. Um, and more so, the priority that human systems and specifically identifying our values and outlining the things that are important to us very practically as humans to survive, inspired by Kevin, for what we need to live to be human, which we'll do a little exercise on a little bit later. And also um, a focus on different exercises and ways of going about identifying our values as individuals that combinatorially becomes the collective and the community. And over time is what defines our principles and our behaviors and everything else. So welcome everybody. It's nice to see someone new. Carl, welcome. I'm going to give a little explanation of what this is at a high level, as in previous weeks, we've had new attendees and we've kind of just jumped into the work, which without a little bit of briefing. So the briefing is we're gathering every Saturday to discuss the core components of, or what we are working to define, what are the core components of creating a regenerative neighborhood. I'm going to share my screen here so you guys have a bit of visuals. And we'll do this short intro for Carl. So this is our digital Miro board. It's like a giant white erase board that we've been doing the calls on and the activities on. I'm just going to scroll here to the top so we can do a little intro for you, Carl, and for all the callers and this recording. So this is a Regenerative Neighborhood Framework call series. One of the truths we've all understood is that if there were more ways to live life as a human in alignment with nature and in alignment with other humans, we'd be better off as a society. The name we're using for this container, this living space that is aligned with nature, aligned with the collective, and good for the individual, we're using the word regenerative neighborhood. Other terms that are prominent are eco-villages, sustainable communities, all of these variations, off-grid, living spaces. So we've defined a regenerative neighborhood to be comprised of a few core components. These are the 5 categories that we've broken it down into to facilitate the exploration of topics. The first one was ecology. We did this 3 weeks ago, where we consider the ecology, nature, and everything around us to be the heart of our design paradigm. We went from there to the other side of things, which was hardware, which are the topics we explored the last 2 weeks. In hardware, we explored subtopics like master planning, housing solutions. And so, interestingly, during the hardware weeks, we got really pulled more into human systems and discussing things like the values of the community and a lot of the human interaction parts, which is what these next 2 weeks will be about, human systems. And so these are the thriving social fabric of the community, governance, operations, education, individual health, collective health, and all of the things attached to that. We're going to be discussing some of these on today's call and next week's call. The other 2 that we'll be getting into in the following weeks are economy and software. So our goal for breaking this topic of creating a new society pretty much down into more bite-sized pieces, we started with those 5 macro categories. In no way is that perfect, but it's a start, and it's allowing us all to get on the same page and start discussing topics in an organized format. The goal of these calls, like we said, is to create a framework. And so we've identified on one of the first calls, what is a framework? What goes in a framework? And these were kind of the defining components of what a framework should include. It should define the purpose of what is a regenerative neighborhood, right? A living place where people live in alignment with themselves, with each other, and with the environment at the highest level. It creates more biomass and creates a higher bioavailability index in that location. We've identified and discussed that the framework should also include ways that we track our progress. How do we measure that we're building a regenerative neighborhood, right? First of all, what is a regenerative neighborhood? We defined the categories that we discussed. Then how do we measure our progress towards building the ideal thing? And then a process on how do we implement all of these resources and knowledge? How do we go about that step by step in some kind of sequential manner? Also, some documents shared that we should outline roles and responsibilities. And so the last few weeks, we've been exploring all of these components. What is a framework? What are the important things we need to explore for ecology? Was these 2 calls I'm showing here, call 3 and 4. And then hardware were the last 2 weeks, called 5 and 6, where we dove into a lot of the topics of these subtopics like master planning, housing solutions. We got into some of them. The second week, we got really, really focused on values. So we started exploring values. We explored them on the first call, where Sonia set up an exercise to define values and principles to help define our hardware decision making process. And that opened the Pandora's box to the biggest question, which is the human systems, the eternal variable. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. I bring your attention to these two sections of values because we will be diving into this a bit more today and exploring that on today's exercises, where I invite you all now here to the human system section. So I'm going to bring everyone to me.
There's a link in the Miro, in our call to the Miro, that takes you straight to the call 7.
Oh, let me see. Maybe there's people waiting to get in right now. No. Okay, cool. There's a link in the Miro. Say that again.
There's a link in the chat, the Zoom chat, to the Miro that should take you to call number 7.
Great. Yeah. Sonia shared in the chats a link that takes you straight over to call number 7. Thank you, sir. Okay, so let's kick off the call with our general practice. You know, that was the review of what we've been doing at a high level. At the today's level, we're going to be focusing on human systems. Carl, do you have any questions? Does that give enough of a bit of a background so you understand why we've gathered?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining. Carl's an architect in the space. You want to do a little intro, Carl? You'll have the spotlight for a second, just so everyone gets to know you. Everyone else has been on the calls and I think knows each other.
Thank you. It's great to join you. Feel compelled to say that what I'm not is your typical green architect, because I think green architecture, sustainable design, is too motivated by technology and not nature-based solutions. So I pride myself in, I'm committed to regenerative design, and have applied my experience to these questions. I'm in Southern California, so these are really important questions that I've applied a lot of thinking in how we build. And maybe just one last an example of my thinking is I really appreciate the breaking down of these categories, but from my understanding is, what really makes it work is to bring them all back into thinking about ecology and hardware and humans at the same time,
Right.
and seeing how they intersect and solving, and then from there, solving multiple problems with the same solution is the key to.
Yay, an interrelational guy, another guy. We got to talk, Carl.
That's all. I mean, at some level, that's all there is. Yeah, that's the starting point.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm going to quote you on that one, Carl, and I'm going to add that to the board, solving multiple problems with one solution. Very cool. If you have any awesome resources, links to blogs you like, or websites or projects that you follow as a regenerative architect, any of this, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we're going to upload them to that Miro board. The end goal of this Miro board and all of these calls is we're putting all of this content together and processing it with an LLM, right? AI is the new buzz right now. So we're using this tool to what it's good for, synthesize a lot of data and give you summaries that are very useful of all of that data that we can gather. Even if we can't go through all of it on our own, it's there and it can be referenced by this tool that we intend to build at the end of, and throughout these call series. And that's the call we do on Thursdays.
Okay.
So welcome.
Maybe just another insight from Village Homes, and also to say Village Homes, it's 50 years old. So the examples of being well designed, it's also been tested by 50 years. So it's resilient. And one other thing, and this is about these questions today, is that it's not your typical eco village where people come together and try to forge a common handshake, or the design, the design was created, and it fostered a natural coming together of people. There was a process of self-selection, but compared to other typical eco villages, it didn't start from a singular government structure. Just
Sure.
another.
It was more
Sure.
like a ecologically sustainable development or subdivision that
I've just shared
embraced
a
these
link to this.
ecological designs.
Is
Yeah.
this the right one? Is this the one you guys are talking about? Village homes in California, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll put in the chat two videos that I always share with people. It's a
Oh,
nice
that'll be
introduction,
awesome. Oh,
and I have lots of resources, and just
mhm.
let me know how I can contribute. Put them into. So
Very cool. Yeah. Anything that you're finding useful in your practices that has like caught your eye as being in the space for a long time is inevitably valuable in some way. If you want to just dump a bunch of links into the chat, that would be cool. I can move them over. You're free to use the Miro board, right? That interactive space that I was just showing you.
hmm
If you can navigate in there and go up, I'll show
Okay.
you. I'm going to share my screen real quick. If you go up there, I'm moving up, up, up. If you go up into the hardware section, you feel free to drop any links in this white box right here that I'm sharing. I made it a little bit bigger.
Okay.
I can bring over here. Yeah, I'm showing cursors so everyone can see it. In hardware, you can share links up here on the left, to the left of hardware. Yeah, or you can just put them right in the Zoom chat, and I'll migrate them over to the board, because it's great to have all of those resources, especially from people that are specialists in the space and working in the industry.
Thank
Carl,
you for letting me share.
Hi, Carl.
Yeah,
This is Kevin Howard. If I could jump in for a second, Oscar, I'm sorry.
yeah,
Carl,
please go ahead,
is
guys.
the Village Homes, is that community in California a sister community to the Cascade Head community on the Oregon coast? And
No.
the reason why I ask is because there's a similar time frame. Both were formed over the last 50 years. Both are committed. Well, Cascade Head is they've put it in their CCRs, committed to the balance between human artistic expression and ecological sustainability. And so I'm wondering if some of the principles between the folks who founded it in on the Oregon coast, and because that's where they did they did the nature reserve on a huge conservation area. So it sounded similar to your project.
Well, thanks. What I would say is probably I don't, as far as I know, and I always look into these people and tell me this or that. But I think that these principles that sound familiar is a good pathway to follow, because they both capture principles that that I think these are the principles that this group is striving for. And for me, as somebody who's been also looking at like cities in India that are 6,000 years, archaeological sites, so 6,000 years ago, you can see the same pattern that work with nature. So when I always look for these how these what are the principles that and so I think that's probably something that you would pick up on.
We have so much to learn from our ancient architects. My
Agreed.
God, those buildings are thousands of years old. One out here is 50 years old, and they're tearing it down.
Well, starting with Indus civilizations and Sumerians and contrasting those, some of them did not have centralized palaces and government. So, yeah, it's fascinating. Goes back 9,000 years. Anyway,
Yeah,
back to you, Oscar.
I think, this conversation is actually going in the direction of, okay, these places were built in certain ways based on a series of values that group of humans decided either to say, okay, we want to live by these values, or maybe they all were intrinsically that way and shared some of these values, and it turned out to be. And I think this is the question that I'm right now excited to explore with the group, right? As today's topic, again, am I sharing my screen? No, let me share my screen. Right, as today's topic is the human systems, we've very critically become aware over the last couple of calls that our human systems are deeply based on the values that we have as a collective, or that we want this container, which is our neighborhood, to embody, so that everyone is on the same page. So I think I wanted to maybe lead with a conversation and a breakout group where I'm going to break everyone into a group. And the question is going to be, it's not going to be the general questions, what brought you here? We all know each other already. I want to ask the question of, when coming together as a group, should we first define what we feel the values of a regenerative neighborhood are, quote unquote, or should we define our own values and see what we all have in common? I'm going to create a breakout group real quick, and I want you and your breakout group to decide on which you think is best. I'm going to give a 3-minute breakout group. And determine between those two things, because I'm not so sure about which way to go from this point. If we should define the values of a regenerative neighborhood, whatever that is, as like, let's say the common denominator container that then people step into and customize by defining their own values and seeing what that shapes out into, or should we come together as individuals and share our own values and see what comes out of that? If anyone has anything to say before we break out, go ahead, Kevin. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Oscar, the reason why, I wanted to interject before we got into the breakout group is because those two choices, whether you're talking about our personal values or the values that we should be discussing as, that are essential for a regenerative community, right?
Sure.
Hugely different. To me,
Definitely.
the personal value, this confusion and this conflation came up in the last discussion, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's appropriate or makes any sense for us to try to agree on what our personal values are. We live our life based on our personal values, and there's nothing wrong with that. And everyone who lives in a regenerative community are going to have personal values. This is not the point. The idea is that the notion of having defining principles by which you're organized goes predates the Magna Carta, predates the U.S. Constitution. The idea it's an organized. These are organizing principles that anyone in the community would align with. Right.
Has to align with.
Has to align with. So we should not conflate this with the freedom to exercise your choices in terms of your personal values, whether you like red or you like blue. Okay. So, but that's one of the choices that you just put for. I mean, we should be talking about if we're not willing to talk about defining values, then we're not going to be able to do this practice. So this is about defining values. Okay. Well, and I think it's really important that we have a demarcation line between trying to tell people how they must live, and what an organized value is, or an organizing value.
Okay. If I may add just one bit from the principles of sociocracy, it's critical to have, for a circle such as ours, to have a clear vision, mission, and aims. Now, implicit in those aims may be certain core values that we believe are unalienable with respect to regenerative villages and the residents therein. Other values can be personal. And so I would just suggest that we aim for vision, mission, and aims, and perhaps cite 2 core values that we believe are unalienable.
Okay, so I'm making boxes for these 3 activities. So mission, vision, and aim.
And we should probably cite back to vision, mission, and aims that Kamara has so nicely placed earlier in our Miro board.
Let's work on this Miro board together, you guys, for this human systems one. I've been receiving a lot of feedback, and I want to shape something collectively, as this is our, us defining ourselves and our human systems and our values, and specifically how that will shape the container of this regenerative neighborhood concept that we're coming together with. So this is my goal. I put that out there to you guys. I have thoughts on how to do it. I've looked up different exercises on how to do it. Vic has shared some ideas. Kevin has shared some ideas. I've had a bunch of links shared with me, and I haven't even been able to get through all of them. So I'd love to decide together on this call, and it's the beginning of our journey of like, how do we decide together? How do we come up with solutions together?
So along those lines, you're describing elements of a sociocratic circle method that works fairly effectively, and you're doing a great job as facilitator in that role. I think I can help a little bit in terms of a sequence of steps based on decades of development in sociocracy. But we can use that method in this circle, and that'll be kind of a nice way to show off the method a little bit. And it can be done pretty informally. And then what is interesting is its meta level, and that is local governments within regen communities. We should consider sociocracy and its related brethren as potential local governance methods, which I think applies to communities of a few dozen members at least. And so at local scale, it's very effective. And it has ways of delegating and whatnot. You can build a network of circles. Go ahead.
Dr. Brian, sociocracy. I don't have any conflict with the theory and with the approach. I just think that it's the function of this group and the people who participate in this group to decide what the framework is. And if we decide it should be based on sociocracy, so be it. Right.
That's fine.
But that can't come to us as a package and within this context because it's worked or because it's been talked about because all these PhDs line up with it. Right. We must apply
it. It's a basis for further refinement. I'm just saying that there's been a lot of work in this area, and we can stand on the shoulders of giants. We can choose what part of it to adopt. And that's why vision, mission, and aims are so important, because for a circle to function, it needs to have a guiding North Pole star. We do have a beginning on that, and of course that can be refined.
No, and that makes perfect sense when we're in a standard operating procedure, when we're dealing with something we've actually been successful at doing. But yeah, we're reinventing the wheel because we don't have regenerative community, generally speaking, in modern society. So we're trying to find it, right? And therefore,
let's take a step back. Both Carl and I are members of the Global Regen Collab, which has been operating for half a decade. And the reason I've been a student of intentional communities like Village Homes or regenerative communities is simply to understand what are the best practices, what's worked and what hasn't. And so, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. It's great to bring in a bit of history, and I'm interested in just providing resources that we can use for further discussion. I don't think we're starting from scratch, but we can choose which elements to adopt for the focus of our work here in the circle.
Yeah, I agree deeply. There's really beautiful solutions that we've encountered out in the wild, visiting communities, seeing how different groups of people organize themselves and each other. And I think maybe this was one of the challenges coming into this goal of the framework. There is no one right answer. There is a bunch of resources with a goal in mind and, different ways to arrive there. Okay, so how do we go about today, you guys? I'm so excited to open up the floor to other ideas. I've created at the bottom of this frame here. Let me share this.
Actually, Oscar, I like your idea of short breakout sessions. It gives everyone a chance to talk, and we can kind of distill the best findings coming out of that back into a group session. I'm in favor of it.
Cool. So that's what I'm thinking. So what should the breakout sessions be? Mission, vision, and aim.
Yeah. And I'd say core values to distinguish it from personal values.
Okay, core values. Right. So this is the core values for a regenerative neighborhood. Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
That's great. And then we can, I think we should find some examples near and far of governance. This is about human systems, right? So I would say local and networked and nation state governance examples to cite to draw from.
Local, network, and what else?
Nation state.
Nation state.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I'm going to leave space in between these so we can put cards in there.
Actually, when it says network, I would say bioregional, if that makes sense.
Oh,
Yeah,
I was just gonna ask what, network seems a little broad, but
well, I
bioregional.
needed to. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I think
I'm
that helps.
Okay, nice. Okay,
Good.
so let's do this. Okay, so when we discuss mission, vision, and aim, we're discussing what is the mission, vision, and aim, because there's also a lot of containers that, Kevin, that word you're using is exactly what's happening. There's a lot of containers that are open. There's like the Masterminding Eden and the container that is this series of calls. Our mission for this series of calls is to create a framework. We know that. However, there's another mission vision, which is what is the mission vision of a regenerative neighborhood? And that'll be unique to the group of people that ideally use this framework to build their blueprint for their community. So what is it that we're aiming here to discover, Brian?
Oh, I think in our breakout, in mission, vision, and aims, I think we should review what has been done already for Masterminding Eden. And there may be some minor tweaks, but I don't even think we got a broad brush right now, on this. So I think it's mostly just review at the moment, and we can table the question of refinement and optimization later. Then that can inspire, okay, what do we want to include as core values? And then from there, let's jump right into examples, because I'd love to have an encyclopedic reference of the different governance at local, bioregional, and global scales that are going to be helpful. Because I think the more resources we have this week, the better. Next week, we can come together having distilled a lot of these and actually have a discussion about the pros and cons of different ones. But let's just collect a cornucopia of governance methods in the third square, if you will.
Sure. Okay, so that'll be the third square. That'll be our resource gathering moment when
Exactly.
we go into that breakout group. Okay, cool. So in the first one, okay, so starting with this first one, mission, vision, and aims, we want to review then the goals of Masterminding Eden specifically. And
well, I think that'll be helpful as an example of regen community. I mean, the task, I think our role is to help design regenerative neighborhoods, and the Masterminding Eden vision mission statement, I think, really is a good place to start.
Sure, right, because we all agree that we're part of this community. We're part of this community that's doing this mission, vision, aim. Okay, great. Yeah, that's a good point.
I think a lot of work's gone into this, actually, and
definitely,
I thank Camara for sharing it.
Okay, so I'm going to make breakout groups. There's how many of us on this call right now? Let me check. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Actually, what might help is if we
should we do
briefly review the document as it is. I think it's got a good start, and people can kind of make little comments as we go. Yeah, that'd be great. And then we could discuss it a bit. I'm in a breaker.
Okay. So maybe I'm going to make space here so we can outline this clearly. Mission. Maybe everyone that is in alignment with something can add a card and describe it a little more. Vision.
Sure.
And aim. Okay. All right. So does anyone want to lead this explanation of what is our mission statement here and vision statement?
I can summarize it a bit. I think the intro and background is a good problem statement. It's kind of reviewing what the problems are that we face. And quite frankly, I will just add a little commentary here that the polycrisis includes climate challenges, it includes governance challenges, it includes biotechnology challenges, and it includes what do they call it? Conquest by foreign powers or aliens or AI. There are all sorts of problems, but a lot of these problems come from over-centralization and kind of global supply chains that, quite frankly, could be diminishing in coming years. And so the motivation to develop regenerative self-sustaining community model, I think, grows out of a desire for self-sustaining approaches that are perhaps decentralized, definitely regenerative. Carl did a great job of describing how it's the integration of economy into ecology, because to quote Tom Chi, all our economy is a strict subset of ecology. He did a very recent TED talk just a few weeks ago on this, and I found it to be profound. And that is, think of the trillions of dollars in our economy. Well, that is a strict subset of ecology on ocean planet Earth, since all the economy is happening on ocean planet Earth. And so um, we need to re-engage a lot of our industry and economy to really reflect on the larger container of ecology and what's required to actually sustain it. So anyway, that's the intro.
Okay. Okay, great. All right. So I definitely align on all of that and on this journey that we're on here. With that, I guess we enter now, the direction I always used to seeing this is like mission, the why, how, what is how I approach this. But why turns out being the purpose at the beginning. I don't know what the breakdown here. She used this word aims. What would aims fall under?
We're still, I think, I just finished the intro. I mean, vision and mission.
Right.
I mean, the vision is our guiding North Pole star. And the key thing about this vision is to understand we're definitely going to have more disasters. We can guarantee that based on more rainfall, more drought, more hurricanes, et cetera. And global supply lines are breaking down in steps and pieces, but they are breaking down. We're getting to a multipolar world. And so that's where self-sufficiency comes in, to where we build a stellar core, if you will, and have enough energy and enough food and enough labor locally that we don't necessarily need a global infrastructure to make it work. And that's going to be critical. And then, of course, the regenerative part is about actually building enough community abundance that whatever regenerative communities we do foster can have enough surplus to help build other communities, to help build other regenerative communities. And so R greater than one literally means a doubling time. And I'll pause there because Kevin's got his hand raised.
I was reading the vision statement, and the first clause I already have I already have some issues with. And so I want to see what the group thinks. So it says Masterminding Eden envisions a world where human settlements regenerate ecosystems. Okay. The problem I have with that is that ecosystems don't have a regenerative problem. That's not the problem. The problem is the human economics, the human geopolitics, the constructs that we have created destabilize ecosystems' ability to regenerate. Right. Yeah. I mean, this is what's happening. So that statement, and this is the hubris of humanity. We are the problem, by the way.
Yeah, the way I interpret it, I agree with you. I think the way I interpret this sentence, human settlements historically have degenerated ecosystems.
Yes.
And so this question of, fundamentally, we have regenerative technologies in the last few years that are puzzle pieces that can help us design settlements that regenerate rather than degenerate. And I think that's the challenge, is to bring in some of those technologies and solutions and values.
Well, and I would not disagree with what you just said, Dr. Brian. What I would say is that anyone reading that clause would think that the expertise for regeneration comes from humanity. Nature already knows how to regenerate. Right.
The point is that human settlements have historically degenerated ecosystems. Maybe we have to put this in the problem statement in the previous paragraph.
But because
we've historically degenerated, how can we regenerate?
That's absent. That's not there in the statement. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. I mean, looking at the statement as the vision by itself on a standalone basis, right? It's suggesting, and the problem is that it is that same hubris that is going to lead us into just replicating the same problems that we caused in the first place, right? We need to approach this from a humble position that the best that humanity can do is understand nature enough to replicate it. We're not the derivative. We're not the source document for regeneration. Nature is.
Kevin, I would just add, I love what you're saying. And so the intelligence that has from humans that have brought us to where we are is also can be directed to be humble and to learn from nature.
Yes,
Just, and I
totally.
think that's to be a really clear part of what we're talking about.
Yes,
And
that's
I
all
would
I'm saying.
actually,
That's all.
I would propose that we move beyond replication and restoration and actually move to regeneration, simply because left alone, marine and terrestrial ecosystems will continue to degenerate for some centuries. And if we want to accelerate regeneration, we do need to give nature half a chance. And that's one thing we're doing with marine permaculture. So it's not enough having killed all the barn animals. No, having opened the barn doors and all the barn animals left the barn. Closing the doors isn't enough. We actually have to restock the barn.
Agree, agree. But I could tell you, it is Madison Avenue marketing to sell that story that the source of regeneration is us. In other words, we created the problem that needs to be undone. Yes, and so the
Totally agree
vision
with that.
that we talked about needs to reflect that. We can't act as if we are the solution. We are very much the problem, and we're still the problem, and we're still not making the changes.
I'm going to throw in my 2 cents here. Can I? It's Vic talking. Is that okay?
Go ahead.
Listening to the conversation is very interesting, and part of my studies has been on, well, first of all, the interdependency thing. So the ecology thing is very important. But our language is keeping us away from the systems we're trying to collaborate with. Language becomes design. There's no way out of it. And we have a language problem that we need to reflect more deeply on. For example, I don't use regenerative, the word anymore. I don't even like the word. I'm starting to experiment with words like coherence. So we want to be coherent with this thing that we are, but we separate ourselves from it just by saying, I want to become coherent or regenerative with nature. I just separated myself in the language. And I'm finding, and I'm just proposing and looking for reflection from you guys, and some of you who are not even here to jump in, on how we build based on what comes out of our mouth, about 90%. And that we need to seriously consider the language we're using in order to build a new world or a new community or a new anything. And if we don't do that, yeah, some of the things like Kevin is saying, we're just going to rebuild the same shit. I'm in with that. Thanks for listening.
I'd like to just put in, maybe we should just try to get rid of isms.
Oh, and isms. Oh, God.
Yeah, let's get rid of the isms. Like, if I could live in a community where I don't need to say a word and no one needs
Get
to
the
say anything to
pitchforks out on
me,
isms.
and like we know exactly what we need to do and we need to do it, that'd be pretty cool. Where it's like, why need telepathy if everybody's on the same page? You know what I mean? Like, why even try to communicate to someone else if everybody knows what the program is? So it's just something I was thinking of, because it's like, ideally, the thing is, regenerative tech gets us back to nature, you know? It reawakens what it means to be human again.
I'm not
Or,
sure about it.
and maybe first, and it depends on, where you're coming from, because if you have somebody that like lives intimately with nature regularly, um, with no use of technology whatsoever, what is the advantage? Why would you ever sell a refrigerator to an Eskimo?
Because what you're talking about is someone living in nature is coherent with nature. Those of us who aren't are speaking of it separately. And then we use words like regenerative, and that's a productivity word. It's straight out of the capitalistic model. It didn't mean to be in the original definition if you looked it up, but it's progressively about the same stuff. So how do we create coherence?
Okay. I do have a partial answer for Kevin's concerns. I think they're valid. Much of this work has actually been embodied in the dozen permaculture design principles, which I put next to purpose and mission. And the reason I cite and link to those is that, in fact, there's a great review of this by my colleague, Dave Holmgren, who is actually one of the fathers of permaculture. And to that end, I will simply like to share my screen and actually briefly review those principles, which I think could answer some of Kevin's questions. So I will go ahead and do that now. And oops, sharing's still not turned on. We'll try it once more time. There we go. All right, so here's the permaculture design principles. I've included the link in the Miro board. What's nice about this is that you can actually highlight these. So principle number one, observe and interact. Watch nature and how it behaves. And that's where the observation comes in. How can we mimic the natural processes? Principle two, catch and store energy. We've talked about abundant energy, solar and wind and renewables, and store in terms of energy storage. Obtain a yield is making sure that our community is ecologically and economically sustainable and ideally year-round. Apply self-regulation and accept feedback, and that is we're living in part of a larger ecosystem, and we have to really look at what's ecologically sustainable as well as what is economically sustainable. Use and value renewable resources and services. Of course, this is the definition of sustainability and regeneration, when we're not extracting, but we're regenerating those resources. Produce no waste, and that is circle to circle, I will say cradle to cradle, life cycle for everything that's produced. Biodegradable is of course beneficial. Design from patterns to details, and that's where we talk a bit about the architecture, the swales, the blueprints like village homes, the integration rather than segregation, and that to me spells inclusiveness. It also means finding a single permaculture intervention that addresses 3 or 4 problems, be they ecological, sociological, economic, etc. And so that integration is one that Carl's really driven home. Small and slow solutions, and that means we're doing small and slow right now, right? We've got a nice circle. We can discuss these things, bring in some nice heterogeneous perspectives, and then refine. And ideally, coming out of these sessions will be a blueprint document, if you will, that we can use and adapt for our regenerative communities and neighborhoods around the world, and then iterate, because of course, iteration is the name of the game. I note with interest, Elon Musk has given up on Mars and he's going for moon. Why? Because it's 2 days to travel to the moon rather than, and I think every 2 weeks you've got a chance to go to the moon. Whereas Mars, it's once every 16 months, and it's like a 2-year commitment. And furthermore, if you just want to talk with people on the moon, it's 2 seconds. If you want to talk with people on Mars, it's probably more like 10 minutes or longer. So the time scales are critical. Use and value diversity. And I've got to say eco-diversity and biodiversity, as well as perspective diversity. We're bringing a variety of perspectives here. And I think celebrating diversity is going to be perhaps a core value. And maybe we'd adopt some of these as core values for our communities and our effort and work here at Regen Villages. Finally, use edges and value the marginal. I love to say life loves a gradient. And what that means is you're living at the edge of the shoreline, or you're living at the edge of the slope. And as conditions change, you can move up and down the slope. I just read about how, in fact, on our community chat, I'm going to get this wrong, but Tesquela Indians of Miami would move between Biscayne Bay during some of the year and the actual Florida Keys during some of the year when the mosquitoes were bad. They'd go out to Virginia Key or Virginia Cay, and that would keep the mosquitoes down. So having that gradient, living on the gradient, enables people to be flexible, and that's where the marginal comes in. And finally, creatively use and respond to change. The whole point of living on the gradient is we can respond to changes, including disasters, including the kind of revolution that we're going through right now, and that is, what is work going to look like in 10 or 20 years? We don't even know. And so by having a regenerative and resilient community where we've really woven and continue to weave community networks, I think that builds the resilience where people can have abundant energy, food, and labor in spite of disruptions in our economy, joblessness, all these other problems. If we can build a community that works, or build a set of communities that work, we can build a network of resilient neighborhoods. Thanks. That's my review. Back to you, Oscar.
That's good. By the way, that language that permaculture uses is more coherent. It is about resonance.
Yeah, but
Lovely.
it's important to note that while that is a deeply thoughtful and comprehensive human expression of what now we have a language problem of the kind of community we're trying to form. You're right. Okay, it's important to recognize, okay, that's one expression of knowledge. That's our conscious knowledge, right? But that's not the full totality of our knowledge. And part of our problem is that we don't recognize the rest of our knowledge. And what am I talking about? I analogize what you just did, Dr. Brian, with if we got some robotics, some person with a doctorate in robotics to come on here and explain the functionality of us standing up from our chairs and walking across the room. That person would be able to technically talk about all the functioning and every aspects of our body that has to be replicated when they try to do it in a robot for how we get up and walk across the room. Yet at the same time, everyone on this call knows how, if they're physically able, knows actually how to get up and walk across the room. They just can't do what you just did, describe it. And so the exercise of the conscious knowledge, how do we describe it? How do we replicate it, right? The best that knowledge can do is be right. But usually it's wrong. Usually it's insufficient. Usually it doesn't sufficiently capture the very thing we already know how to do. Right. And so what I'm trying to say here is that the what we're trying to replicate does exist in nature. And our physiology is entirely a function of nature. That the separation is our construct. And if we tap into the basis of our evolutionary development, right? How is it that our bodies know how to function? They didn't go to school to learn how to function. We got that information from the fertilized egg that we got from our parents. In the same way and the only change in generation after generation after generation is what humans actually experience, and that informs that collective genetic code as to how to modify over time. So what I'm trying to say here is that we risk replicating the same problem if the only thing we want to recognize is what is the science, what is the theory, what is the research for us to articulate what regeneration looks like, right? We can tap into that just by examining what does it mean to be human, because we are all human, but we never think about that. And that's what I'm saying. If this is where the conversation is, this is where the collective wisdom is, right? Because that does tell us a lot.
I made a space on this board for what does it mean to be a human, inspired by you, Kevin. And so I would love to actually explore that a little bit more. On last week's call, I asked you specifically, like, Kevin, what does it mean for you to be human? I would love to see your answer on that. And I remember you wrote it somewhere. I just can't find it right now. Do you remember where you put that answer?
You can use command find.
I think I put it in the value section somewhere, but no, there is no, I mean, it's a practice that each one of us can participate in. And this is what we should talk about, because again, it's not been a part of any educational program. It's not been a part. Most people don't think in these, they take it as a given because we are human, right? But what that does is allow us to make choices that actually endanger our ability to live, right? Well, that only is possible is because we've lost connection to what it means to be human. I mean, if you know you survive based on the contributions of thousands of people you'll never know, how do you frame your whole life on just advancing your own self-interest at the expense of the very hands that serve you? This is what we are doing in modern society. That is only possible because we've forgotten what it is to be human. Right? We've forgotten that we can't.
I think we're dealing with a lot of hierarchies. You're talking about symptoms of strong hierarchy rather than decentralization. And I don't think we're that far off. I mean, you're describing some aspects of right brain thinking, collective wisdom, et cetera. And of course, the wisdom of ecosystems. By the same token, principle one of the permaculture system is observe and interact. And that means observe nature, interact with the rest of nature. So in what way yes, the permaculture design principles are somewhat left brain in their presentation, but there's enormous right brain thinking going behind those. I mean, even if this dissertation is a bit left brain, do you really see points of disagreement here?
No, I don't see any points of disagreement. It's just the confidence that this is comprehensive that concerns me.
I'm not saying it's comprehensive. I'm just saying it's a great design point that moves us in a direction. Go ahead.
It's a starting point. Good starting point.
I understand.
Well,
The starting point.
I would want to say one of the aims and goals, I think, of a regenerative neighborhood would be, well, like, how do you gamify bioregional stewardship? And how do you make a platform where people can play the game of bioregional stewardship? We don't have a clear-cut platform for bioregional stewardship, like in a gamified digital sense. And that would be for the bottom line of any ism. So, you could have teams.
Yeah, we should cite to Joe Brewer's I don't know, decade work on bioregionalism, because it does provide a framework. Bioregional Earth is a whole website on I've been participating in some of those group sessions. I mean, they've got many years of development there.
Yeah, they have some good lectures from that what is their bioregional conference that they do, the R3 network.
Yeah, and they have design paths for regenerating Earth, one community at a time. So I think there's a whole community around bioregionalism that I'm still learning about.
I'm just like thinking, like, how do you make it into a game that you can buy into without money? Like,
good question.
How do you buy, like, using the old vernacular of the monetary system? Like, how do you buy in or invest in that game, and what is the incentives you get out of it? Like,
yeah, I mean, I would actually consider their group to be a bioregional game. If you want to gamify things, it's multiplayer and it's more social than it is, gamifying.
It's funny because it's like it is that, like, it's where professionalism meets fun.
Yeah.
Yes,
But see, Eric, okay, I think that's great and everything, but okay, if we're talking about how we exist, if we're talking about how our children is going to exist, how our grandchildren, all that type of thing, right? What kind of motivation do you need? Why does it have to be gamified?
Well,
why does it have to be incentivized? Survival is basic.
There's not a lot of things I can see in the future, like the scope, the window of what I can think of as the future. Like, it's smaller because of how complex it gets. So it's like you kind of just have to wait and see. But one thing I think I could guarantee is that games, if people are around, they're going to want to play a game to pass the time. So I think that's something that's, like, very important. I mean, the hunt, it's a part of being a human organism, right? We were hunters and gatherers, and we made this whole new game in the last 10,000 years, and I guess we're just trying to refine it.
Called money.
Well, I think that's extraordinary. That I don't think there's another species that needs a game in order to function in a way that allows it to survive. I mean,
I would want to say that there may not be another species that's, sorry for sounding like this, controlled or trapped into this word game, but all species appreciate and participate in fun.
Of course,
for me, the first principle to idea of game is fun.
The idea of being playful,
Except that cuts across all species.
Carl, okay, if the house is on fire, seriously, if you're sleeping in your bed and you wake up because you smell smoke, right? The motivation, if you need this to be fun, what comes next? There's something wrong. There's something deeply wrong, because and that's what I'm talking about. We are talking about the ecology that sustains human life, right? And the problem is that we're debating on how we should stop destroying it. And that possibility is not because we are insane. It's because we've separated how we survive every day from how we make choices every day, right? And so, and the solve to that problem is not gamification. It's reconnecting into how you survive every day. Because if you remember that you can't survive without thousands of people you'll never know, you will never make choices that suggest that those people don't matter. That's how we make choices right now. We need to reconnect with our basic humanity. How do we survive every day? We are a function of nature entirely.
A counterpoint to my point, which is kind of aligned to yours, but like in a different angle, is like breaking out of the game, because there's a lot of people I know in my personal, just in my life, people are stuck in their games in this world. So it could be from anything from getting the next Lamborghini to getting the next bag of drugs or something. You don't know. It's a lot of people are entrapped in these socioeconomic games. So it's just getting a game that is more appealing than the games that are already on the street.
I would like to share that a perspective on this is that the game of power, right? Conquest for power has simplified into making money. And so that game is all encompassing in social and society, because it also determines your value within the pack in today's standards, you could say. So I think, Eric, where you're going is like we need a game that's more engaging than that game that currently exists, which money is the metric, and it's also tied to your social standing within the pack, etc. But so I agree with these things, and so I think part of that journey is what we're doing, which is defining. I think going by the permaculture principles is a very strong direction. I guide my personal life with that. I guide a lot of the work I've done with the permaculture principles because they are as close to base to nature as we can imagine. If these are, I consider them to be more than any other thing I've read in the past. So, Kevin,
well, I would say if we're going to do this, sorry to jump in, but it's an important point.
Go ahead, please.
That they're all models. Okay,
sure.
All models are useful. None of them are the truth. So
yes,
models are wrong. Some are useful.
Thanks for the correction. We all have to use at least 3 or more models if we're going to use modeling. So we start with the permaculture one. It's a great idea that they have eloquence with their language. It will get us engaged into more of the emotional space of the human condition. I do believe that. Maybe we take biomimicry models next, and maybe we take, we choose a few models and then correlate them as a longer term conversation about where they're good, where they're bad, and how my values fit in or not. So
sure.
And
so and when you say models, you mean like principal models, like this model that Dr. Brian shared of permaculture principles. This is the model for permaculture, right? Is this what you're referring to? Because I guess my next question would be, what other models exist? Right? My goal for this framework is that we put on this board as many relevant models, projects, links, resources as possible. That's my highest level goal from this. Over, getting lost in executing one model and identifying whatever that is. It's identifying other models that exist. So I just made a box for that as well. What other models exist here?
As long as we recognize that all these models are tools, and the user, if the user is screwed up, it doesn't matter how good the tool is. I'm just saying, garbage in, garbage out. We, we need to get the humanity right. Let's get the humanity right. If we as humans can remember who we are, literally, and actually then look at the model from the perspective of being an actual human and not these avatars that we've created, because we went to school somewhere, right. Then, then the models can achieve what we're trying to achieve. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Why can't we get
all right,
back
that's
to the
fine.
humanity?
And Kevin, I think you raised some interesting points. 97% of the history of the human species has been decentralized. In other words, that we've found recently that Homo sapiens goes back 300,000 years, and at least the last 294,000 years of those 300 years has been nomadic. It's been decentralized. It's been foraging, and it's been in small communities. And so if we go back to that, I think it's another way of saying the same thing. Interestingly enough, we can point to not one, but two ancient civilizations, one in the Indus Valley and the other in Turkey, that had no centralized palaces. They had no centralized governance. These were, the Indus civilization had a bunch of people living together in the same city, actually, but there was no grand central palace. There was no, mayor's mansion. There was no White House.
And
And
what do you
so
credit that working to? Like strong religious values that tied them? Because usually that seems to be the case in other examples like this.
Yeah,
or what?
I will
What
say
would
the
you?
strongest example of this is in the Indus Valley over the last 6 to 9,000 years, and that civilization lived for several thousand years before the water changed and it dried up. But many of those peoples went further to India, and so I would actually look to Buddhism in some ways as being a derivative of the thinking that went into the Indus civilization. So
Sure, right.
there
So
is a
maybe that
strong
can be
tie to
another.
Buddhism.
That can be another one of these models that we're talking about, the Buddhist principles and values. I'm going to add that one to the
Like
list.
like a bioregional egalitarianism.
I think so. They really
That's
didn't have. There's no archaeological evidence for kings in that one, and there is archaeological evidence for kings in the Sumerian civilization, and contrast in Macedonia. And so I think we can look to Indus and Buddhism and other elements that actually tie into this and is a bit more in keeping with what Kevin's talking about. And I would say decentralization is key. And, there's a huge amount of rural environment that's mostly empty. And now that we've got Starlink and the ability to communicate with everybody, moving to a more rural environment actually kind of makes sense. Because if you look at a city, it's a bunch of mouths to feed and not enough land area to
it's a
feed them.
very poorly constructed infrastructure every time. It's a
Yeah,
it's
it's a
a
trap.
prime example of anarchy. It's a beautiful art form of collage, but like
Good point.
Well, I'm an advocate for human social evolution. In other words, I do
Great.
think that we do respond to what we experience and we learn from it and we make adjustments and we make adjustments and we make adjustments. And to the extent that we don't make adjustments, then we go extinct, right? That's and so there I'm not suggesting that we need to go back to a globally decentralized system, though that
Mhm.
it did work. We were
Mhm.
more in touch with our humanity, more coherent with nature in that context. But we have benefited from generations of experience, and since that time that we can benefit from as we craft, as we co-create the next stage of human social evolution, right? And so I would put it out there, Dr. Brian, that if you characterize the Dark Ages as a time when the individual was subjugated entirely, primarily to society, to social power, whether it's the king or the pope or whatever, right? And then since the age of reason, we flipped the switch, and the individual, I think, therefore I am, became elevated to the point where society became subjugated to the interests of certain powerful individuals, right, that maybe the next stage of social evolution is the age of balance, where we recognize that our agency is essential to who we are, yes, right, but because our survival is a function of our cooperation amongst each other as a species, along with other species on the planet, right? That social order does matter. So we need both these things in a way that doesn't smother one or the other. We need balance, right? Right now, society is being completely smothered by narcissists, right? Whatever you want to call them, right?
It's feudalism, feudal overlords.
Okay. So it maybe in other words, we can learn from these experiences. Late stage capitalism has taught us a lot, as to
Mhm.
how could we organize in such a way that, yes, we have 8.3 billion people or so, so we can't all be hunter gatherers per se, but how can we organize ourselves in a way that honors what it is to be human amongst all of us, that it creates an environment where we can sustain within the planetary boundaries of the planet, right? And that actually nurtures community. I think it's going to have something to do with the balance between the need for community and the need for individual autonomy. And
Right.
we
Well,
haven't
so you're
had
asking,
that
how do we
in
do
modern
this?
civilization.
Right. Your question was, how do we do this? And I think that's what we're working towards by having these calls, is like, instead of just asking that question, is going, okay, well, what is the best way we do this? One of the best ways we understand is by honoring nature. We discussed ecology. Another way we do this is by ideating how we build physical structures that hold us. We kind of discussed this on hardware. We're going to have to go into hardware again because we didn't get a lot of resources on that one. And now the next piece is definitely curating the human system that guides our day to day in a safe way to express it with others. And this starts with defining the values and the principles that are the foundation of everything else that goes on top of that, right? Does that seem like a logical progression?
It's a total logical progression, Oscar. I'm merely saying, and this is the point of the values exercise, is
Yeah.
that the first step in designing human systems is to be on the same page as to what it means to be human. I mean,
Sure.
this is who you're trying to serve, right? And if we can get on that page and have those conversations and actually engage in conscious, thoughtful analysis on what it is to be human, right? You will
Right.
see the wisdom that comes out of that informs the kind of systems that would support human thriving. And
So I want to bring.
I want to throw a question to Kevin because Kevin's really good at questions.
Yeah,
Yes.
get it. Go.
The idea of getting onto the same page seems like a enormously rooted in Western thinking of centralization.
Agreed.
Fair enough question. Okay, that's certainly not what I'm suggesting.
I offer that just to be a little is I think decentralization is really important. And I made a couple of comments in this. I'm just going to share this because this is a really great community. Um, so one of the things I've looked at as an architect, an older architect, is this. Well, it started with this discovery in school where we're taught to draw perspectives, and we're taught to believe that the perspectives that we draw, Renaissance perspective, is not just an art form, but it is how we see the world. And this very specific way of drawing has shaped Western culture beyond ways. It's so embedded in us that we don't see it as a system that we invented. And I say much of the way we continue to language things in this call is based on this worldview that man is at the center, that's influenced by Renaissance Western perspective.
Exactly. And you're nailing it, Carl.
And I say this as so. Um, I say this, and I've also noted this that for me, in this exploration of like perspective, it's gotten me to realize that there are other perspectives. And in fact, most perspectives within outside of Western colonialism are more similar. The one I use as a model is Chinese perspective, which is multi-view. And there are many, just as an example of some things that have been said, like Kevin, you mentioned, we need a system that allows us to honor the emotions, which is part of Chinese painting. It accepts that emotion is part of who we are, and it's a system, if you will, a system for recording how a human interacts with nature in an emotional way, not just how we see it.
Yeah.
So I think Chinese perspective and this is rooted in Buddhism, Taoism, it's tremendously important. I think valuable language for because also think painting is a language. It's a language that frees us from these words that trap us into preconceptions. So it's a language that's open-ended, is expansive, and that we can start learning about nature and ourselves at an emotional level, not restricted by some words. That's my.
And Carl, and I hear what you're saying. So to be specific, because there's nothing, I don't intend to establish centralized principles. Our lived experience tells us that we don't produce what we need to survive.
I use that as an example. What I want to try to do is use an example of there's so many ways that we language things that is it comes from a history, and when we often miss how these histories have shaped how we language and see things.
You're making my
Well,
day, Carl. We're
but
back at
Carl,
the language thing again.
this comment started out as a question. I have a question for you, Kevin. That's what you said, Carl, and I respect that. And it turned into more of a rhetorical question, let's say. And what I'm saying to you here is there's nothing about what I'm saying that comes from a Western civilization perspective of central control or centralization.
Oh,
I'm saying
I would, from my impression of you as a human being based on this, I
yes,
totally get that, and I trust you.
right.
But we're still, with your golden heart, you're still trapped into part of how you articulate things.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's,
yes, I'm limited by the language, and that's true. And so but understanding, as you well know, is a function of understanding who's saying what they're saying and the words that they're using, to get the full meaning, right? So you'll get to know me, and you can
There
interpret my
is no
words accordingly.
meaning until two people
Yeah,
are in coherence with that understanding. There is
but
no
let's have,
meaning otherwise.
but,
There's
but
previous belief systems, and I'll hear what you say, and out of my belief system, I will interpret what you said. And it may not be anything about
like
what
what
you
I said.
said.
Okay, so what I'm talking about, though, because I think Carl's point is well considered, I do, right, is that it's the aspects that are unique to each one of us that make us human that I'm speaking to, that provides a certain wisdom that is as decentralized gets, because it's validated by our own lived experience. It's not validated by Kevin Howard. It's everyone on this phone would be able to say, yes, I don't produce the air I breathe. I don't produce the food I eat. Okay, so how do you survive? You survive within the context. We exist. Humans exist within the context of the atmospheric pressure of this planet. They exist within the context of fertile soil that allows us to get the nutrients to grow the food, to get the nutrients that we survive on every day. We exist based on so many things that are beyond our control. And so the values come out of that, because the values that were organized in modern society suggest quite to the contrary. They suggest that the only thing that matters is me, right? Everything is balanced to the individual, is biased to the individual. And so we have to get back to how we actually survive, to start remembering, oh, okay, yeah, the trees do matter. And there's a lot of people who don't think the trees matter, right? I don't know what on this
I,
phone is that, but I'm just saying that's how detached we are.
the and I plead guilty of seeing everything through Western perspective, but it is an enormously influential part of Western culture, and it's not didn't invent the idea of man in the middle, man in the center, but it has perpetrated the idea of man in the center, and I could and this is something that's important to me, and like a book that I'm writing is the history of perspective and perspective machines. So this perspective that we think of as the perspective, it was invented in 1413 by one guy, and it has shaped Western art and Western science. And I think the machines that we use that Western science has been based upon is based on these principles that were discovered in 1413. So we are so enmeshed in this worldview, which is centralized. We are separate from, and so from my thinking, this the centralized economic extraction, measuring, it comes from it comes from this these principles, and then why what I'm excited about Chinese perspective, traditional Chinese perspective, it's open-ended. It allows emotions. It allows, man is not in the middle. That, like, the core principle is man is not the middle. Man is a small part of nature. So I think this is something that's I think provides a lot of insights about what we're talking about.
I agree with that.
Good. One thing, patterns that have worked really well during past sessions have been breakout rooms, having timers, and actually collecting resources. And I would propose, Oscar, that we consider using our time to collect resources that enable human governance systems at the local, regional, and perhaps network state level.
Yeah. Okay. So, it's 4:27 now, which means we're almost at the end of the call or whatever the scripted time is in case anyone has a hard stop time. I want to check in. It's been a very flexible, let's say, format that we followed on the calls. Every call has built on feedback from the previous call, on information that we realize, oh, we need more of this information. Let's leave more time for that on the next call. And so far, I don't know. I want to get everyone's feel. Like Dr. Brian. So the very logical side of me is like, okay, success for me means that we get 5 to 10 links or resources for each of the subcategories, and that feels like a win for me. There's another side of me that is like the more soft skills and human-centric piece. That is like, okay, these long-winded conversations where we each get to go deep into our perspective on something and bring up something is super useful. In most calls, it's a little bit wasted because it just kind of gets lost in the, in the digital space. In these calls, however, because we're recording all of this and, this Chinese process you shared, Carl, thank you for sharing that. I'm like doing a little research on it. I've added some of the values and principles from it onto the board. Again, my best case is that I'm gathering all of your brains, as much of your brains onto this digital document that I can. That's the win for me. I'm essentially trying to clone all of your intellect through the LLMs at some point, putting it very directly. So I wanted to share here how next to these boxes where we put principles for regeneration and values of a regenerative neighborhood, I pasted some that had been included from a previous conversation, as well as what other models exist. I added here the Chinese perspective. Thank you, Carl. That was really good. I put here the permaculture principles that you shared, Dr. Brian. I wanted to ask, who shared this pure first principles? Who put this on the board? I've never seen it. And, pure first principles. Who put that? Maybe.
Yeah, it's me. I'm observing Russian speaking space, and there are a couple of permanent individuals there, and I'm trying to.
Cool. Yeah, you're doing great. That's a really interesting one. I read through some of it. I'm going to read more about that later after the call. So a reminder to you guys, it's lovely for us to chat and share because I'm recording and I'm taking the transcript from these calls as well to add as a data source to the LLM. Please also add links to things. Carl, I saw you added some links. I've been pulling those links and adding them to the board. Thank you very much. Same with you, Kevin. I'm super grateful that day, which here on the screen, what does it mean to be human? I added the description that you shared, things that are known, that no human is more human than any other human. All humans have an equal claim to resources, not equal, in the way that you described it. And so that is also very useful to get that in writing on these boards. So aligned with what you just said, Dr. Brian, yes, our goal is to get resources and things on here. I think tightening the scope to what specifically. So here we created this box of examples of governance systems, both at the local, the bioregional, and the nation state level. I would like to add governance systems in here. I'd like to add Thomas's model of potentialism. I've had a few calls with him where he's been giving me his documentation, and I've been massaging that with the LLM and getting some solutions out of that. His concept is a hybrid of sociocracy, meritocracy, and some other formats, all for measuring the most value something brings and evaluating it that way. So super interesting. I'm going to share some links for that in there as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Thomas, for sharing all that stuff. You're on the call. What's up? Welcome. Thomas got here late. Hey, Thomas.
Yeah, hello, everyone.
So I guess my question is, how are you guys feeling about, it's getting really, which I'm happy about. I'm happy to say that the calls are getting out of my control, which initially I'm just, I'm just gathering bright individuals that have a passion for one or multiple of these 5 categories. And like you said, Carl, from the beginning, the magic is in the cross-pollination of the categories. Like, great for 5 architects to talk about design, but when you bring in a human person and an ecologist and an economist and a technologist to that conversation, it gets exponentially more interesting. So I guess I want your feedback, you guys, as anyone that's here. How do we plan for the next call so it feels nourishing for all of us? The floor is open. I'd love to hear some feedback in the last few minutes of the call.
Well,
Dr. Brian,
usually, yeah, when we have pairs of these, a lot of the first week, we've got 2 weeks to cover human systems.
Sure.
I think information gathering is, the expansive, what are the possibilities? That's what we should be doing today and this week, is collecting as much information as we can, enabling people within our circle to learn new things that they hadn't been exposed to before. The second week ends up being more synthesis, and that is bring home what we've learned and identify some best practices, some key principles that we that resonate with the community and that we have consent to go forward with.
I support Brian partly about that. First of all, time, it's got to be longer than that, because we're meeting once a week basically on this, maybe twice. But the other is I do think, and I think this is what you said, is it's okay to be divergent for a while and messy and chaotic, especially now that we got LLMs that can organize the shit out of it later.
Right.
And we can experiment with everything that we said and posted, but we should be in these cross-pollinated, messy times and permit it, because it's a healthy space. Chaos is an extremely healthy space. So I'm in with that, and eventually we move toward divergence, but not too quickly. Convergence, sorry.
Convergence, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm just looking at the timeline that we have for each of these categories in a first pass, and I think multiple passes are worthwhile.
Definitely. So to maybe be the Venn diagram, the intersecting Venn diagram to both of those points. Yes, we set this like very tight agenda, 2 calls per topic for the next 13 weeks with the end game originally was that Masterminding Eden would be at the end of these calls. And we wanted to gather as many resources as possible to be prepared for that in-person gathering and give the people meeting there some starting point. Because the postponing and delay of the in-person event, we have the flexibility to say, hey, maybe human systems is a huge topic, and we want to do 4 weeks of Saturday calls on human systems, where we create 1 call for the cross-pollination time. This call was kind of a feeler to see where everybody wanted to go. I didn't want to say, here are the activities, everyone do this for 5 minutes. I thought about originally, if you guys are seeing my screen, originally I thought about with Sonia, we created this space here to give everyone, I was going to do breakout groups, leave each group of 3 or 4 people to do a full culture canvas exercise, which is an exercise we like to follow with physical communities to establish their foundation. Right? Everything from purpose, value, priorities, rituals, how we communicate with each other, etc. All of these things. So that was a thought. Another thought was to have other participants of the call lead certain exercises they wanted to lead. Kind of wanted to do this with Kevin of what does it mean to be human exercise, which we didn't even get to because the cross-pollination time was so good. Also, Vic, I'm excited I read through one of the descriptions of the activities that you shared. If you guys want to take a peek at that, Vic shared it up here as well. Where was it? Here, right? Yeah, Vic shared a interesting exercises that helps differentiate values from needs, from beliefs, from principles, and kind of this journey of the 130 values with the 9 columns and how we can organize this. Vic, is that an exercise you're going to want to lead? Maybe a Saturday, maybe another day, we can schedule it and promote it and see who shows up, right? The people who show up are the ones that need to be there.
I'll lead an event like that as long as it's put out there first and it's not just a show up and people have time to, think about it. And I don't care if they join or not. I think we should have a couple of things going on at the same time. Like I say, an open space technology approach.
Right.
And yes, I would gladly run one of them.
Okay,
this
cool.
one being, these boxes and images you have up, that's all my shit. They're correlated with the idea of values, but it expands out into strategic planning. It looks at multidimensional languaging like ecology, economy, equity kinds of stuff, and the value set, which is what I probably would start with, which is a highly researched set of words that people use to define their values, not their needs, not their principles, values. So I would probably go like that.
Yeah, I like how this thing broke down that values are, no, where was it? Here. The values are relational. You live them with others. Principles are behavioral. It's what you do. Beliefs are the things that you think, and needs are the things that are universal, right? I think needs, this is what you're touching on, Kevin, right? If I'm right. If I'm correct me if not. Needs is what you're defining, Kevin. Yes, and then what you just mentioned, Vic, is your principles. No, values. Sorry, values.
Well, I mentioned all of them because it has to be they're interdependent. So you can't just do one. And what we're creating here is a language architecture, and I think that that's critical to social design. If a new social design, we're all here thinking we're going to create something new. Back to my rant that we won't unless we have a language architecture that's different.
Yeah.
Sure. And so I think I want to leave this as a reminder as well, kind of touching on Dr. Brian's point that we're gathered here, maybe not necessarily to invent anything new at this moment. What we're gathered here is to define what are the questions. Inevitably, we know for sure we have to include some process that best helps the individuals of this initiative define their values, their principles, and understand their needs well. What that series of exercises are, I think part of the challenge we're facing right now, I'm observing this as a space holder. And I'm realizing I don't want to say we're going around in circles because we're just exploring things, which is good.
No, but it's just chaos. It's okay.
Which is good, right? But to clearly identify, there's two things here. There's us defining what questions need to be asked and identifying that, yes, we know we have to get values and principles and needs. And I think what we're going into is trying to do that in more detail by doing certain exercises together, because it's a good way to learn for sure. But again, back to Dr. Brian's point, our goal here is to go through all of the topics and share what things exist and our potential solutions. Not saying that is the definitive solution yet. And that's what the Saturday call is about. From there, we're definitely going to be finding this need to do this open space concept, which I agree with. Vic, by the way, Sonia added a calendar here. So this is an invite to anyone who wants to share. Where is it, Sonia?
It's on the top in the main section.
Sonia added a calendar here that allows, if anyone has an idea for a topic that they want to share, or someday during the week that they would like to share a call or an activity. Vic, we're going to test drive this with your experience and also with Phil. Yeah. Phil wants to lead
I'd gladly help you with that because I've done a bunch of them.
Cool.
And what we may want to do is move toward an uncon, which is an unconference.
Right.
So the unconference model's all over the web. Go look it up. But that idea uses mostly open space technology frameworks for people, empowering people to the information, not a few people on stage. And so then we would be gathering that over a few weeks, and then we would have this uncon, and everybody would come in and play. And I know how to design those, so we could do it.
Okay, cool. So yeah, let's have a check-in call this week about that a bit. We're adding that to the board because I'm realizing what the Saturday calls have been good because we've been very diligent about, okay, here are the 5 topics and subtopics. Let's chat a little bit about each one. And now 5 minutes to add resources. And we did that for a few cycles and it's been good. My personal desire is being satisfied from that. And I'm realizing from the collective calls that there's also a bit more of a desire to dive deeper into certain sections, specifically human systems. And values has been the first request, right? Needs, values, principles. So this unconference style model of, let's say, another round of calls, like example, we started hosting the Thursday calls because we need more time in a group to do LLM processing and get feedback and spend time on doing that. So that's what the Thursday calls are about. I see it beneficial that we add another call during the week that'll be community held about human systems, or it could be about anything. You know, maybe Carl, you want to run something on hardware.
Let's see what the community wants to bring forward. Not you, not the facilitators, but those that, you know, and that's going to be a challenge because I said before, most of us aren't used to that approach. So, you know, we're going to be kind of shy coming forward to do our thing.
Sure.
And instead of, okay, April fell through, maybe April is the uncon because typically it's a few days.
Right. True. And we can do an online thing. Sure. Like that.
And then move, like with some of the things Brian was saying, etc. We can move toward that, including looking at some of these models, multi-model, polycentric modeling, and having conversations about them and looking for correlations and relationships, because that's where the insight's going to emerge.
Yeah.
I'd like to raise some awareness as to a risk, and that is our community, our circle is, barely 10 people, less than a dozen at the moment. And, maybe some more people are coming in, but I think we risk the challenge of diffusing our energy a little bit. And thus, I really do like the structured example of the 13 weeks. And could we actually produce a working document at the end of that time that provides an initial pass on all of the 5 areas of development? I think it's our challenge and opportunity to put a stake in the sand, if you will, in April, and that is get to a working document, optionally an online unconference. After that in April could make sense, and then in Q2 we consider some deeper dives, but also outreach. I mean, I'm really glad Carl's joined us today, and I think there's a chance to outreach to the Bioregional Design School, to the Global Regen Collab, to a broader circle of Masterminding Eden folks. And when we have a document that is clear and perhaps concise, at least in the executive summary, then, with that document in place, that gives some meat for people to chew on, so to speak, for those non-vegetarians. And furthermore, can be a launching point for second quarter and further work in 2026 that could draw in a larger audience. So I would encourage us to focus on getting through our 5 topics and actually getting a synthesis and integration, and try to produce that in April, and have that goal for producing it in April so that we can use that as the basis for further expansion of Masterminding Eden and regenerative neighborhoods.
But are you going to be comfortable with, if there's 50 topics first, everybody's going to have them? Can it be divergent for a while and let people present their stuff, and then it will converge?
The point is there's 2 weeks for each of these topics, and so I would just use the diverge converge on a light touch on each of the topics.
On the one that Oscar made,
we've got this first week, which is highly divergent, I will say, and then I would propose next week we work on a bit more convergence, and to that end, I put an agenda outline that matched some of our previous calls. If we move within a call from structured to unstructured, then everybody can feel heard, and we can actually, I think, do pretty well. Oscar, you've done a great job of that, on many of our calls. And
where did you share this agenda?
What's that?
Where did you share the agenda? I'd like to put it
in the chat. In the chat, I just said, we can start with introduction, which we did. We can go into breakouts, which we haven't done. We can have reflection and findings from the breakouts. We can go through the exercises that you've curated so well previously, and then we can move into that open discussion, which this entire call has been open discussion. And actually, I'm feeling a little bit frustrated that we haven't made more progress on diversely collecting all sorts of resources that I think can go into local, bioregional, and nation state
But it'll happen,
governance.
Brian. You're so far ahead of most people.
Yeah,
Let it
this is one of
happen.
those examples of like you got your pinky toe all the way on the 100th step, and it's like not even the first step. Like I don't know. It seems that's a bold. People say that to me. My friend said that to me. But like
Yeah.
for me, the human systems almost is like people might really dislike what I have to say, but it almost to me is like irrelevant because in my mind, I'm like coming from a technical engineering aspect of like building and an environment like as a contractor would to go or a landscaper go out into the ground and plant trees here for this cenotropic farm here, route canals here for our logistics and for the waterway health of the bioregional shed if necessary. These are just like out left field examples of what I'm saying, but I'm like human systems to me it's like the expression of the freedom of cultures and embracing the evolution of all emergence of all cultures and belief systems like it's so over encompassing it's like why even I guess it's not shooting fish in a barrel but is that it seems difficult it just seems like do you understand what I'm saying though like I
Not
don't
a
not
little bit, but
discredit
not fully. Look, it's an unbounded topic. We need to do a good job of binding it, or we're going to diffuse the energy of
unbound.
our small group of 10 people. And I see a major risk, and that is if we go down a rat hole too far and it's not constrained, this group's going to disperse, and we're not going to have a
Well,
nice document
yeah,
at the
and it
end.
already is dispersing. I talked to two women on this session or different sessions here very briefly. I saw their frustration. They're not here anymore. So they didn't have space to speak. And maybe they don't speak and they're slower at it. And they're not coming from this, educational perspective that the bunches of us here are using. And I think we've got to really watch out for that. And if we
Yeah.
move too fast and don't have patience for messy and permission to let people come in, that's what community is, and that's what we've got to have more time for.
Sure.
So the opposite, Brian, actually, in my opinion, from what you just said.
Oh, actually, I wouldn't be oppositional about it. I think we've got a chance to finish our agenda for the few weeks that we have left, and then to do that. And I agree, there's a gap. If we're losing people, we should come back to it. But I want to reflect. Sonia has her hand raised. I'd love to have her speak.
Go, Sonia.
Hello, hello. Sorry,
Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I would love to share to what you're sharing, Vic, about losing people. There's definitely some structure that we can implement, and structure is emphasized here so that everybody has an opportunity to speak. And I think even more structure would encourage people. I share a little bit of the frustration that you feel, Brian. And I did feel a sense of that during the last call, especially because the last call, the Thursday calls are meant to be focused on building infrastructure. And we, completely diverged into a conversation, which was a very valuable conversation. And today's conversation is very valuable as well. And I would love to encourage us to be a little bit more solutions-based when we're having these conversations. Okay, I shared this, I asked these questions, let's list these questions, and maybe these are the questions that everybody thinking about creating a regenerative neighborhood needs to ask themselves, or maybe there's a framework to be developed for this specific topic that we will include in the framework, because this is what we're here to do. Yes, we are here to talk about our individual and collective values. We are here to think about our experience and share that with other people. And the biggest goal is we are here to accomplish, document the framework, something usable for more people to come with a variety of resources without actually trying to solve something with one single resource. So I really appreciate you, Dr. Brian, for adding tangible resources and bringing us back to the solutions-based conversation. I also think we should do more passes on human systems, and I actually am a little bit sad that we didn't start with human systems in the very beginning, because something that I realize over and over again, pretty much every week, is that we didn't really have a governance conversation, which we should have had, right? Like, as we're adding resources, of course, there's space for everything, but we, as a group, working group, we should have a process for decision making together, and then we could also decide now, okay, what is the structure of the calls? How do we make that decision together? What do we move forward to? So I would love to just align with you guys whether we're going to be doing 2 passes on the human systems. Are we still keeping up with the schedule of 11th of April we are presenting the framework, or are we extending it for 2 weeks? I still think any of you that feels that there's a gap to be filled, please propose a session, and that doesn't have to be done on Thursdays or on Saturdays. But you, Vic, you propose, oh, I want to do something. Okay, plan it, and I will join. Maybe more people will join, and that's how we add more meat to the bones, and also are more proactive and solutions based as a group. So yeah, let's decide whether we want to do 2 more passes in human systems before we go into economy, or how are we gonna because I personally think we should talk about governance and 1 hour and a half maybe next week. I'm fine with that, but that will extend the timeline a little bit. So yeah, Dr. Brian.
We have a number of governance approaches, and I'm happy to help provide resources there. I mean, Vic's raised a really important point, and that is, if we are losing people in the circle, it'd be good to really take a moment to get some feedback, and that could be offline to some extent. But I think, Vic's got some knowledge. We can talk with a couple of people that were in early, and if there's a way to change the way we run these calls so that it can be more inclusive, I think that would be key. We've already highlighted that diversity is wonderful.
So we could reconnect with people that lost. I bet they're not lost, but they could use a little more personal conversation. I would agree and support you however
that's
we could on
tactical
that.
exercise. That'd be huge, because I think we should be a learning organization if we can. And then, look, I'm a little worried that human system, we can go down a rat hole and spend a lot of time and not get a working document at the end. I really like the idea of multiple passes, and that is, we're peeling the layers of the onion. And if we stick with the original, plan to get something out in April, then we can have a group that does a deep dive into human systems, and they could spend all year doing that if they want to.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not talking about a plan complete by April. We're in preparation for an unconference, which is still planning. It's a much longer process. We're just moving toward convergence at that point, not divergence.
Yeah.
So, hey, Oscar, and I purposely just kind of tried to listen to all the feedback on the conversation. My feedback is my feedback is going to be sort of comprehensive in terms of all the calls that we've had leading up to this one. And it does speak to what Vic was mentioning, as some people who had attended these calls and found that ultimately this wasn't serving them, or they couldn't participate, or we were talking about other things. One thing that I see, and I think it's a cultural bias, is there's a heavy lean in this group towards the more technical and complex aspects of what we're trying to do, and an apprehension, or even a belief that potentially that it's a waste of time to talk about foundational issues. So, Oscar, you had been clear that coming into this call, right, that we were going to talk about these values, right, what it is to be human, for the purpose of framing the conversation on human systems. I mean, I think it's an extraordinary thing that we can't have a conversation on what it means to be human when we're intending to talk about human systems. How do you design human systems if there is confusion over what it means to be human? And I think the fact is that some people think that there is no confusion on those things and that it's self-evident. And what are we talking about in the first place? This is the problem. Our cultural reality demonstrates that there's a detachment from the idea of what it means to be human, and and so I'm offering to the group once again, if we want to, no matter what models we use, no matter what models we use, the people who are participating and using those tools need to be on this, need to have some organized and I don't mean central. I'm sensitive to what Carl was saying. Based on our individual lived experiences, there are needs that all of us have. And the presence of those needs convey a wisdom that informs the systems that that we need to set up that would accommodate human thriving, right? And that there is a detachment in modern civilization from those things, and we need to. That's why we need to look at it. And the idea that that was the intent for this call was that we were going to have a 30-minute breakout group to talk about this, and we never got to it.
Right.
To me, this is not accidental. Vic had mentioned it multiple times in previous calls that there could be apprehension about people having that conversation because yes, it gets sticky. Yes, it gets personal. That's exactly right. But it's supposed to be. But if we don't get the virtue, the defining virtues right, it doesn't matter what we're doing. The rest it's the foundation. It's the basis by which you have a regenerative community. If you're going to have a regenerative community, is that you get the virtues right, the defining principles right, right, and they can't come in a prepackaged box based on 10 years of research or 20 years of research. No, they have to be. Everyone here has to buy into it, and that's
They
why we
they,
start with the needs.
they have to be lived. Like that's
Yes, lived.
yeah,
Yes,
we can't do that right now. We are not all in the same bioregional location. We're not all in the same room. Like we're
but
in the
Eric,
same
there's
room,
this.
but
That's true, but that's why I'm saying we're not. There's a difference
we're not
between
cooking each other breakfast in the morning.
no,
We're
and
not
that's
Yeah.
doing each other's laundry.
Yeah.
yeah. But the thing about it is, Eric,
Sweetheart,
the
what are you
fact
offering?
the
I mean, if it's a group home and I don't have to pay rent, then yes.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
sure. No,
the thing
seriously, if you
is,
got a house, I'm about it. Do we got a garden? So we can grow some food and
I,
I just don't want to pay no, I don't want to touch any money, you know.
well,
That
if that's what's necessary for us to care about each other, for us to get on the same page, this is the part of the problem. Because I can tell you, yeah, I've never physically met you, Eric, but the fact that you are making a
I don't mean to
contribution that serves me,
humor.
that serves society,
Yeah.
matters to me. In other words, you matter to me, right?
Well,
Even though I
I no,
haven't,
I really I
but that's
appreciate it.
not.
There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of spirit. I appreciate it.
But we have to tether it to the fact that it's not a nice thing.
Yeah.
It's a true thing. It's a factual thing. I can't exist without the Erics of the world doing what they do, right? And what's the implications of that, right? The implications of that is that all of us really do matter. That and not just us, other living creatures that humanity relies on. If we don't have the critters in our gut, we don't have gut health. Okay, right. And so what I'm saying is to actually understand what that means and this is where the defining virtues come from is that because every one of us are subject to it, not because Kevin Howard said it, but because it's our actual lived experience that it says that we have to have bees in order to eat. We have to have on and on and on.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
so
there's something that's come up in multiple like video chats I've had, and I was thinking like, you need to have everybody agree that it can happen, exist, and it's real. Like, you may not, science says you don't have to have anybody believe it as long as it can work. If it's something that can be done, like if you can land on the moon and you land on the moon, you landed on the moon. You don't need anybody to tell you that you can or can't. But when people are coming together to do something, you need people to agree that we can land on the moon. If everybody's like, no, you can't fly, then the Wright brothers, they proved them wrong, but the Wright brothers had to believe that they could. So, like,
And that will come in time, you guys. It will come in time. It's not the thing you start with. And I'm going to mention something about, I noticed Brian mentioned that about the women ratio with Bioneers. I was at the biomimicry conference and it was 1 to 7 women to men. I was one of the only guys. It was wonderful. But the point being that it's all men here, except for Sophia, Tonya. Sorry, Tonya.
Sure.
So that's a signal that we are speaking from a space that is extremely limited. And if we don't have women here, this ain't going to make it because communities sort of need the female. Any thoughts?
Sure. So, okay, I would like to share thought on
I think we
this.
just need to get some feedback, and we also look to a couple of communities, including Bioneers and including the Bioregional Design School, which have managed to have majority women participation.
Yeah.
And so,
We gotta
part
get
of it,
those
and
women in.
Kamara can provide some guidance here, and she can make some inquiries. So, let's consider revising our weekly call agendas so that it can be more inclusive. And
I
there's
think
plenty of ways of making it work.
so. I'd love to share a perspective with you guys. I've hosted a good amount of calls in the last couple of years, and I realized that by nature, the name of this call series, Framework Design Lab, or whatever the thing says, is by nature a very technical container. Um, like on the
It's
description, it's
masculine language. Yeah.
right, right,
Yeah.
and so it's for me, the goal of these calls was to create a tool at the end, right? Like what you were mentioning, Dr. Brian, is to have a somewhat functioning product at the end that others can use without even joining the calls and find some value in. I realize that there is a very important part of these calls that also has to come through, which is human interaction. And doing both at the same time is probably impossible, unless we have longer calls.
No, it's
We're like,
possible. I've been
right,
in.
we're like the
Possible.
first hour is heart-based idea sharing, and then the other hour and a half is like tangible. We have 5 to 7 minute slots of topic sequence, and the whole hour and a half is mapped that way, like we did the first couple of calls, which was more structured, more engineered. Here's an activity, tell me what you think for 2 minutes. And so I've devolved from that very structured process to a more unstructured process where the participants dictate what we're talking about. I think the easiest way to do it is to create 2 different calls, one for each thing. They can be back to back, where we do like an hour and a half of kind of this topic that what we just did. And then for the next hour, we're just going to focus on resources for these 5 containers. 2 minutes for this one. Does anyone have something to share about it? Great. 2 minutes for this one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to get your thoughts on that. I'm gonna join some of those Regen, the bioregional group calls. Some friends of ours that are living here in Colombia have been joining them every week and sharing with us which ones seem really interesting. I'll forward those in the group on Telegram if anyone's interested in joining. I'm gonna do some of that research of why those calls are more gender balanced. From what it seems like, they're describing conceptual things and discussing things versus nitty gritty specifications and technical documentation. So that already feels much more engaging for let's call it the feminine energy of a group, which is to explore ideas versus putting structure on the more masculine logical side. I feel strongly the solution is to hold a second call where it's clearly described as the human connection philosophical, right, exactly. Conceptual discussions. Kind of what the goal was of call 1 and call 2 for each topic, of kind of how we structured it originally. I don't know.
I'm not for separating them because we have a psychology group on this planet that has written their own book over their own oak table,
Yeah.
and we're all
yeah.
supposed to follow it. I don't believe in that approach.
Okay.
It can get
I'll
scary.
support, and I do have to go, but I would like Brian. I would like to talk with you about your idea to get in connection with people in these small groups or give them a call. However, I can support that. Count me in. Carl, I'd really like to talk with you sometime as an architect. I like what you said, the newbie here. Maybe we can find a way. I sent you my contact information in the chat. So, sorry guys, I do got to run. I needed to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say, Vic, why don't let's circle in Kamara into that conversation because she'll know
Good
all
idea.
the people to contact
Very
as well.
good idea. I
Yeah,
sent you a
and
thing on Regen, so you have my contact information. The tribe thing.
Regen Tribe. Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, I'm on theirs too as well.
This is good stuff, you guys. It's messy. It's okay.
really good. Yeah. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. I really enjoyed this container where you guys just kind of like took it and I was just trying to like
It will
take notes
converge. We're all
and
so
scribe it.
impatient.
Yeah.
We need a structure by Friday, for the stockholders. No.
Okay, we'll give you till Saturday.
Yeah.
No, I love the idea that this one of my mantras is nature
Thank
is
God.
messy. Nature is messy, and we have to figure out how to live in that mess for a little while.
Live in the mess.
We
Yeah.
gotta figure out as
Bye,
humans
all.
with our
Say
primal
bye,
brain how
guys.
to
We got
Bye,
one
Vic.
gal left. Tonya, thanks for hanging in there with a bunch of crazies.
we're
Yeah.
here. We're here.
I
Giuseppe, your camera just came on. I'd love to hear some feedback. You caught like some of the end of this call. Any perspective? We're all like neck deep. We've been in it for a few weeks now. You want to share something with us?
Excuse me, I'm late, and I am a Brazilian, and I don't speak English very well.
Okay.
I understand that you are working in a Canvas, and I would like to contribute a little. Well, till next Saturday, okay? Or you are going to meet in Friday?
Yeah, we
I
will have a
can't get-
call. We will have a call again next Saturday, same time, 3 p.m. EST, where we discuss more human systems. If you have any ideas, feel free to share them in the group.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a nice carnival.
Thank you.
Bye.
So Dr. Brian, we set out some goals for next week's call, right? You put it on the board. You shared like a sample, like what that call could look like, where we do intro, breakout groups, reflection and findings, exercises, and then some open discussion. We're going to lay out some like maybe boxes like last time where we do a box for each one of the subtopics and let everyone be like, okay, 2 minutes, go into your archives, dump resources. Thank you very much. 2 minutes if anyone has anything they really want to share. And we go through all of the subsections that way. We'll set up the boxes. Yeah.
And then follow up with open discussion, which we started with that today. We spent the whole time doing open, but I think that'd be great. And I think this is really mirroring what you've set out in previous weeks, and that'll help us get through the initial, the outer layer of the onion, produce a working document suitable for an unconference, and then propose deeper dives. I mean, we may have people that want to spend half a year on human systems, for example.
Right. There's some people that will only spend time on that, and that's invaluable because they'll spend time with the architect group and design the best thing.
Like whoever's in the Telegram, I shared a group of playlists, and it's about 2 years worth of videos that I watched. There's a lot to human systems. I mean, like you guys were saying earlier about governance, or philosophy or economy to me is a human system because economy and ecology, it's like so ecology to me is economy is the ecology of humans, right? So that's a human system. That's I have just a lot of like ontological, like I have like presets, philosophical presets that are like leading me into different directions. So
Dude, the thing is, they all bleed into all of them, right? We're by nature creating something that isn't compartmentalized because nature doesn't work that way. It's easier
yeah,
for our feeble human minds to understand each thing in each drawer. It helps us, but nature doesn't really work that way. And so we're doing our best to let the things bleed into each other while still categorizing them so we can make some kind of progress, right? If this was all our full-time thing and we were all living together for a year, we would figure it out.
yeah,
But we have one call a week where we're doing our best, and I'm really like grateful for all of you showing up, sharing what you're sharing, getting I love today's perspective of like Vic on one side and Kevin, like this is the most important thing. And then you come in over the back and you're like, yo, this is completely useless. Not useless, but
no, I mean, yeah, that's where I'm because I
dude,
was,
that's the
it's,
power. Each one of us has our
yeah,
lens of expertise and experience, and
sure.
you're both right. It is super important in some scenarios, and for some other scenarios, it's the least important thing. And that's what makes this journey and what makes community creation so exciting for me is like the number of variables, the number of different directions it can go in, and still wanting to herd the cats towards a final goal, which is we want a product ready by end of March. Um, I'm on track to doing this, Dr. Brian. I don't know if you saw the first version that the LLM gave us of the
Mhm.
framework skeleton. I was honestly very impressed because I've seen a lot of guides and a lot of like people's books on how they did it. So here's their, 10-step guide, 20-step guide, whatever it is. Ours is 11 steps. And the way they did it pulls from all of them, but did it in a unique spiral concept, which I found really cool. Right? It's
Great.
definitely not generative, but it stuck together a bunch of things and came up with something new. And to me, that is as close to generative as it can get already.
Wonderful. Well, the spiral is a
Yeah.
great theme in nature, and I'm reminded of natural shell architecture, where
Mhm.
it's bigger and bigger
Right.
circles.
Right. It's fractals. It's one fractal that
Well,
leads to the next fractal that
Mhm.
leads to the third fractal. Yeah.
that was one
Agreed.
thing I wanted to mention about those playlists that I shared. If you go to any one of those videos, you can apparently upvote or downvote, and like
Okay.
that could be a task that would be like a gamification of gathering information on human systems because human systems could take several. They never end. It's never ending.
Correct. It never ends. Right. It never ends. As
So
society changes, blah. Where did you put those playlists?
I put them in the chat and I also put them on the Telegram. I
Okay,
didn't
cool.
label them specifically. I labeled them on the YouTube, and some of them are like kind of irrelevant. Like I don't really like the idea of bringing politics into this per se,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
to consider politics as a necessary reality, um, like going through those videos, like I think I would have to go through those videos and actually listen to them all over again, which would be kind of enjoyable. But that would be like a year's worth of like an actual year's worth of time, and that's a
Sure.
full-time job.
Sure,
So
man. Maybe
like
the
I
best we
just
can do is post the transcripts. Maybe you can take the YouTube videos, pull the transcripts, and put all
transcripts.
that in a Google Doc, and then we can process that. Could
Yeah, and
be
I
an
could like reading and listening to them again because that's some of them had really great applications because you have like NGOs, you have public
yeah, yeah,
land
yeah.
trusts, you have like when you talk about legal systems, it makes me think of like all sorts of jurisprudence. In
Sure.
psychology as a whole can of worms, and then spirituality. That's
Mhm.
a lot of different disciplines of religions. At
Oh,
least
dude. Yeah, yeah,
at least one finger.
yeah, yeah.
You
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Like we have so much to cover, you guys. Right? Like, right. So just a reminder. Okay, so guys, we're way over time. Thank you guys all for joining. I want to just bring this screen share to the forefront of of all the other calls that we've done. This one has the most amount of subcategories, the human systems, right?
Mhm.
It has
Mhm.
everything from community membership and agreements. We need solutions for that. Example, other communities you know of that share their bylaws and their membership and agreement process. That could be a good example solution that we put in there. Governance, this is what Dr. Brian was specifically talking about at the
Mhm.
local level, by a regional level, and international level. Um, operations, logistics, and project management, potentially in their tools that people use or processes that you know of. I love like the Scrum model, and let's go roles and
Right.
responsibilities. And so for all of this stuff, legal topics, security and safety, PR, marketing, education, physical health, mental, emotional, spiritual, collective personal development, conflict evolution, culture, and art. It's so much stuff. This is one of the
Wow.
biggest categories by subcategories. So
That's
maybe you
huge.
like one or more of these. For next week, our goal is going to be to gather at least one resource for each of these on our call, like we did in previous
Mhm.
weeks. So this space will
That's
be
going to take the
here.
whole call, I bet, if we do one at
Probably.
a time.
Right. If we do 2 minutes for each one, it's going to take the whole call pretty much.
Right. Right. That's huge.
No, 30,
Well,
50
that's
people.
great. And I'm wondering if we should work on it in advance and should we use this Miro board or the Tribes platform? Maybe we start with the Miro board and start including resources.
Sure. I think start dropping links into this Miro board.
That'd be great.
Yeah. I think that's the easiest way. We'll make this a little more spacious so there's more like places for
Yeah.
cards. And that'll be, I think, the biggest goal of our call next week is to gather at least one resource for each of those or two.
Sure.
We'll figure out some questions that we can ask for the breakout groups. Like when we do the breakout groups, what are the breakout groups going to be about?
Yeah.
Maybe we can share some ideas in the group chat of like what that could be like. Yeah, I'm
Maybe
wanting to be more receptive of ideas from everyone on like how do we do this as a community.
you could
Obviously, I
do a
have my ideas and I could lead this like a train and be like, here are the 6 activities, 4 minutes each. That's the call. Thank you very much. But I want to be more open and receptive to it.
Um, the breakout rooms could be each one of the. I would be a lot of like breakout rooms, but I mean that could be an example. Like each breakout room is one of the aspects of the human system. So if
Each
anybody wants,
subtopic, sure.
yeah, if anybody wants to talk about governance, there it is. If anyone talks art
Right,
spirituality, there
right.
it
I can make
is.
a breakout group for each of them and say, everyone go to that group and
Mhm.
Whichever
share
one
I'd
is,
this.
propose we're gonna have a
mm,
lot of people talking with themselves at this scale.
Yeah,
What I
yeah.
would propose is that we use the breakouts to make sure everyone gets to speak and be heard. And we did that even at the beginning, but it wasn't enough to retain
Yeah,
our women in the conversation. So I
agreed.
think we should use the breakouts judiciously, and that is at the beginning, enable everybody to have a time to speak, and then come back and roll up the key findings from and the highlights from the breakout groups. And then let's cover all this stuff offline as much as we can, and then bring it online and make sure we can touch on each of the topics during the next session.
Yeah, I agree. That's good. I would like to also add um, that we honor when somebody raises their hand, we honor that right away to
Agreed.
avoid a back and forth that could be a one-on-one conversation between some of us. And another one would be, I don't know if everybody's comfortable with that. I definitely don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, but just calling out some of us that didn't speak for a while, like, hey, what do you think about that topic? Is usually a good practice because, yeah, we have different
Yeah,
sensibilities in the way we show up in social groups. So I find that to be valuable. So maybe we can exercise a little bit more of that on top of the breakout groups.
that'd be great. In fact, that's a key part of the circle method is to actually go around the entire circle. And if there's a proposal on the table, get thoughts and feedback on each one.
I have a share thought about the breakout rooms.
Yeah.
Um, are you suggesting that the breakout rooms are organized, or do we have a breakout rooms that are that are not so defined, so allow people to kind of to use the model from GRC to pollinate and talk with each other? Because it seems like if we have breakout rooms with breakout rooms that are defined, that's going to decentralize or concentrate people's interest when we're trying to find out what people are thinking.
Sure. And so I I think what I'm struggling with when there's a lot of breakout groups is, when, for example, if I have a goal in mind, I can kind of lead a conversation and make sure we stay on target. But when there's random breakout groups, I hope that by putting a prompt to the breakout group, it at least starts off in that direction. Inevitably, it's going to go in its own way. I think my bottleneck is I wish I had scribes in the group, someone like annotating what happened, and at the end of the breakout groups, or maybe we outline that each breakout group should have one representative that shares a summary of what was discussed during that breakout group, and then it could be like no frame. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. It shouldn't be a problem if it's well described in the Miro. If there's a clear prompt, it shouldn't be a problem. We shouldn't make breakout groups complex, like multi-layer. It's just one question, one prompt, one breakout group, and then this is discussed, and then yeah, the findings can be shared by one person. And it can always be a different person from the group.
Maybe everyone in the group chats, in the telegrams, wherever, drop breakout group ideas that you think would be a good catalyzer to kick off a good conversation that can denature and go its own direction, but becomes a good, like, okay, guys, we're going to do a 10-minute breakout group with 2 or 3 people in your group. And it's this topic, it's this question, it's this thing, like Eric, you just suggested maybe each one of the subgroups. I agree. Maybe that's like too broad and there'll be just one person in a lot of groups.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Right.
I
Maybe we
got
can do
two
like
data points
clusters.
on this that could be helpful. One is Zoom has an AI companion that is somewhat helpful. The second is there's a resource that I've put under international, and that is Audrey Tang's Modern Polity. GitHub actually facilitates, they had 45 rooms of 10 people each, and they had an AI facilitator that made sure everyone was heard and actually summarized all 45 rooms and got the best practices boiled up. And so there's actually open source technology that does help this. And that's interesting at 2 levels, and it's interesting for how we might manage our breakout rooms. It's also interesting in when it comes to governance at the network state level, because it was used to produce some best practice democracy outcomes for deep fakes in Taiwan at the level of 450, 500 people doing citizens assemblies and sortition.
Okay, interesting. Okay. All right, you guys. Well, again, I'm left with more questions than I came in with at the beginning of this call. I appreciate everyone's feedback and excitement to do this. I admit also this week we were a little bit caught up with stuff, and I didn't do my weekly like blast where I go into every WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook group I know and send invites out. I've been doing that every week. I didn't do that this week. So whoever showed up just showed up from practice. We missed the 3 or 5 new people that come every week. From that, I'm going to be more diligent about that this week. I also invite you guys all. We're going to share the flyer earlier in the week. Invite a friend. Thank you for inviting Carl. Carl, what a pleasure to meet you. I'd love to pick your brain way more on, resources that you know of in this space. Did you share your info? Yeah, your email's here. I'm going to shoot you an email.
I think I've shared all the remaining meetings with Carl. So, Carl, if you're willing, we've got another, half a dozen meetings to finish? Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, well, pleasure to see everybody. Nice to connect again and see you guys. Martin, good to see you. You want to share any feedback? You were just here.
Yeah, my connection is very bad today, so hopefully, but I was enjoying most of the discussion, but didn't have much to add. So I like more technically focused talks, so maybe next week will be better for me. And I shared some stuff, so if anyone has time to respond or add comments to that, I'll be thankful.
Okay, where did you share this stuff? On the board?
Yeah, it's also on the board in the other models, or what it was called.
Okay, cool. Yeah, what other models exist?
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, I see. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. Like, I think we got a lot of good resources from that. Like, what are other models that exist? It's pretty good for principal models. So that was a good question, Dr. Brian. Thank you for sharing that one. All right, you guys.
Which one are you referring to?
Say again?
Which one are you referring to specifically?
Where you branched off and you asked, oh, what other models exist? As we were discussing like permaculture principles. And then I think you mentioned, oh, what other models exist? Because that could be a good, way to gather different perspectives for a solution, which I think is, again, the best outcome of this series of calls, that we get a bunch of perspectives and we have an LLM that based on our goals, it can maybe suggest to us some mix hybrid of all of those things, which is what the LLM did for the current framework suggestion it gave us. And I'm actually very captivated by it and excited to start using it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right, you guys, happy Saturday. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you all for participating and being here.
You as well.
We'll talk soon. Feel free to message me, Telegram, anything in the group chat. It's pretty lively in there. Everyone's sharing on there pretty frequently. So get in there and we'll stay in touch, you guys.
Sounds good. Thank you all. See you next week.